Hello, my name is Leonard, and this is Symantec Enterprise Vault 10 for Exchange Administration, lesson number 4, Configuring Vault Storage. Again, we're continuing on from the installation process, which was a separate e-learning course. We went through the configuration of the Enterprise Vault, and now we're ready to start creating the Vault Storage part of the Enterprise Vault environment so that we can start the actual mailbox archiving tasks themselves. So in this lesson, we're going to look at an overview of the archive storage and the basic architecture of that storage. We're going to look at how we're going to create a vault store and a vault store group. And then we're also going to go through and look at the physical piece of the puzzle, which is the vault store partitions and how we create those and the different types of items that we can store the vault store partitions on. And then we're going to look at configuring the sharing levels. The sharing levels are actually going to be controlling our efforts at deduplication, which is going to impact our single instance storage. So we'll go through and look at how to set that up, and those things are going to work. So the first thing we're going to look at is an overview of the storage associated with Enterprise Vault. We're going to start off, we brought up some terminology in an earlier lesson. We said that a vault store group was a logical container, and that logical container was responsible for grouping together a collection of vault stores. So in this particular example, the vault store group has its fingerprint database associated with it, because that's going to be used for the single instance storage. It currently contains one vault store. We said that the vault store also had a database associated with it, and that database is going to keep track of the metadata for all the items that are stored in the archives. And we said that that vault store would have partitions, and in this example we're showing one partition with each one of the partition states. There's one closed, one open, and one ready. We'll be looking in more detail a little bit later in this lesson, specifically what we mean by closed, open, and ready. Now, when we're talking about the vault store group, we said that it didn't have to just have one vault store. It could have multiple vault stores in there. And when we're setting this up with the multiple vault stores within the vault store group, we said that we're going to define this as our optimized single instance storage boundary. So when we go through and look at this, this is going to be where we go to configure that sharing level, which is ultimately controlling our single instance storage. So how does Enterprise Vault Storage work? Well, I'm going to take an archived item, and it's going to be broken into two separate parts. The first part are the shared properties, also known as sys parts, and then there's going to be the unique or unshared properties, which are the per user parts. All the items are going to pass through the fingerprint engine. The fingerprint engine is going to be more efficient than doing a binary comparison of the actual data. Once again, we're going to use an algorithm so that if two items are identical, they should have the same fingerprint. So I can use this to determine if a particular item is a duplicate, and if it is a duplicate item, then that item is now available for sharing. All of the fingerprints are going to be recorded in the fingerprint database, and remember that there's going to be one fingerprint database associated with each vault store group. The per user, the archived item, and the content information are all going to be written to disk separately. And what we're going to do is we're going to have different file extensions based upon the type of information that's there. So the per user part will have a .dvs file extension. The sys parts will have a dvssp file extension. And our converted content files will have a dvscc file extension. You may see one other type of file extension associated with shared items, and that's for very large files. And very large files will have a .dvf and a number associated with that particular file extension. In this particular course, we won't see any examples of that. We will be looking at examples of the DVS, the archived and items and sys parts, as well as the converted content parts. Now, one of the things that does need to be considered or mentioned here, and we'll come back to it again later in this lesson, is that I have to determine if it is efficient or it makes sense for me to determine if an item is shared. So what we do is we have something which is called the fingerprint threshold, and this fingerprint threshold by default is set at 20 kilobytes. So if a particular item is less than 20 kilobytes, I'm not going to consider it for sharing. This is because the overhead of fingerprinting it and then determining whether or not it is available for sharing is more than the storage gain that I would have by being able to do single instance storage and deduplication. So let's go through and try to put this into kind of a more of a process or workflow type of an environment. So the first thing we need to do is to archive the mail message. and we're going to get into more detail about the processes associated with the actual archiving of the mail messages in a later lesson. So I archive the mail message. It's going to identify the eligible parts for sharing. Then, as we mentioned previously, it's going to fingerprint each part of that message, and then it's going to have to search the query database to determine the shareable parts. If it finds a fingerprint entry for the one that it's generated, it assumes that that particular item has already been stored. So therefore, instead of actually storing it to disk, it will just make a reference to it in the database. So that particular item will know that that shared item is already stored. If it doesn't find it in the fingerprint database, then it's going to have to store that particular item and make an entry for that particular fingerprint in the fingerprint database. And then the last thing we're going to do is write that unique piece or that per user piece part to the actual disk itself. So fingerprinting, we have what we call the fingerprint engine. This is the mechanism that can determine whether an archived item or part has been previously archived. And again, we're going to use this idea of a fingerprint, which is going to be a hashing algorithm that uniquely identifies the entire item. So therefore, it should, if there's any content change, the next time I generate a fingerprint, it would get a different fingerprint. So therefore, if it has two different fingerprints, I have to assume that it's two different items and is not available for sharing. Now, not only can I use it for sharing, but I can also use it for validation. Once I've archived that particular item, when I try to retrieve it or access it, I can go back and regenerate a new fingerprint, compare that to the one that I have on file in the fingerprint database, and if they still match, then it was the same item that I actually archived. And as we mentioned earlier, the fingerprint database is associated with a vault store group. If you have more than one vault store group, you will have more than one fingerprint database. The database itself is structured to scale to any size that you would probably have in your environment. And the way that we do that is within the actual structure of the SQL database, that is the fingerprint database, we have 256 separate tables that are going to be storing these sys parts equally across the 256 tables. Now, each one of these tables can store approximately 4 billion fingerprints, which means that a single fingerprint database can store approximately 1 trillion fingerprints. Now, not only that, but I can then take that one instance of the database and roll it over 32,000 times, which means I can ultimately end up with 32 quadrillion fingerprints. And that's usually going to be good enough for most environments. However, again, if you decide that you need bigger than that, you just create additional vault store groups. And again, you'll have a separate fingerprint database for each vault store group. Let's go back and look at a little bit more detail of this fingerprinting engine and the process that goes into fingerprinting. In this particular example, we're going to be starting off with an email that has two attachments, a Word document and a PDF document. It also is going to contain a forwarded message that has an Excel spreadsheet as an attachment. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to split out the attachments. So you can see I pull out the PDF, the Word, and the Excel document. The shared part of the message itself is also going to be split out. Again, we'll see, well, actually, if you get into details of the message itself, there's going to be parts of that message that is unique, and there are parts that are available for sharing. So we're going to take a part of that message that is available for sharing and fingerprint that as well. So the fingerprints are created, and the fingerprint database is queried. So you can see in this particular example, there's already a Word document and a PDF document that have been shared from a previous archival process. So now once I've done that, the fingerprint database will determine if one of the sys parts with the same fingerprint already exists in the database, which means I've already stored that item once. And in our particular example, we're going to see that we assume that the Word document and PDF have already been archived, so the only thing that I need to store as a sys part is the Excel spreadsheet. Now, of course, I've never had this message before, so I have the shared part of the message that will be archived as a DVS. And because that message had been previously archived, it will also be stored as a DVS file extension. The exact files that are stored are based upon the initial message size and content that was originally in the messages themselves. So let's look at how we go about this process of setting up the Enterprise Vault storage environment. And we'll start off with creating the Vault Store group. First thing, the overview of our Vault Store group. We're going to go through, and as we remember from earlier lessons, the the vault stored group contains the vault store. And also that vault stored group has the fingerprint database associated with it. Well, within the vault store itself, the logical structure of the vault store is that it has a vault store database that's going to store all the entries that are located in that particular vault store. Now, in our example here, it shows you that we can only have one open partition at a time. So in this example, the blue colored rectangle, if you will, is our open partition. We have 3 closed partitions that were closed earlier based upon archiving items in them. And we've also configured this one for a partition rollover. And we'll talk more about partition rollovers later in this lesson. But we have one partition that is ready, which means there's nothing stored in it. I'm not writing to it. But if for some reason the open partition were to either manually be closed or automatically reach a condition to force partition rollover, then that particular partition that is currently open will close, and the ready partition will then become open. And we'll see examples of that later in the course. Now, the next thing we're trying to represent, which again, the partitions are the physical structure that makes up where I'm actually storing the items. You can see that I have a mailbox, and that mailbox has been archived, mailbox 1 to archive 1. Now, the archive itself is not associated directly with any single partition. A particular archive can span multiple partitions, and that's what we're trying to show you here is that mailbox 1, 2, and 3, which are all archived, to archive 1, 2, and 3, are spanning the 3 closed partitions, as well as currently the active items are being stored in the open partition for those 3 different archives. And we'll come back and talk in more detail about the state of the partitions, closed, open, and ready, a little bit later in this lesson. So if I need to have this vault store group, how do I go about creating one? Well, we're going to define the vault store group fingerprint location, and then we'll go through and create the actual vault stores themselves. As part of this process, we will be specifying the SQL Server database location as far as what SQL Server it's going to be on, as well as the file locations for the database and transaction logs. We're going to specify safety copy deletion, and we'll get into how that's going to remove the original item once it has been archived, and then we'll review the Vault Store summary. Now, normally when you go through the Enterprise Vault Administration console to perform this action, the new Vault Store wizard will immediately lead you into creating a new Vault Store. And then the new Vault Store wizard will normally run you right into creating the new Vault Store partition. Because the thought process is that if you're creating a Vault Store group, you're going to want to put at least one Vault Store in it, and that one Vault Store has to have at least one partition in it. Now, we've kind of broken it up in the discussion a little bit to cover the 2 logical pieces first, which are the Vault Store group and the Vault Store, and then we'll come back to the physical piece, the Vault Store partition, separately. Creating the Vault Store group in the Enterprise Vault Administration console, you can see we've navigated from our directory to our site, and then we have a node called Vault Store Groups. So we just have to right-click on that and say that we want to create a new Vault Store group, and that will open up the new Vault Store group wizard. When I create the new Vault Store group, as a reminder, it will contain the Vault Stores. It will create a fingerprint database, which is going to be determining whether or not a particular item is a duplicate. So that's going to determine how I'm going to share items and which items I can share, which gets us our single instance storage boundary concept. Now, for defining the Vault Store group fingerprint locations, you need to specify a physical SQL Server where they're going to be. You also need to go through and specify where the database file and the transaction logs are going to be located as well. Now, an option that's available, because again, we were talking about how big this fingerprint database could get, you have the capability within SQL Server to set up the database files to have both a primary file group and up to 32 secondary file groups or non-primary file groups. And this is a mechanism where if you have multiple SQL servers, you can spread out the workload for this one particular database across multiple SQL servers. So you do have the option when you are configuring the Vault Store fingerprint locations to say that you do wish to have a primary file group and you want to set it up for additional file groups. If you select that you wish to set it up for additional file groups, you will have to specify where the other SQL servers are for the secondary or non-primary file groups. Now, once the Vault Store database has been created and I've gone through the completion of the Vault Store group wizard, it will prompt me to say that would you like to create a new Vault Store? So when it goes through and immediately runs the new Vault Store wizard, I can start the process of generating that Vault Store. So I just, again, if I'm following along or continuing on in the wizard, it'll prompt me for the SQL Server location for where I wish to have the Vault Store database located. And again, I'm going to specify the location for both the database files as well as the transaction log files. And we just want to remind you that for best practice with SQL databases and transaction logs, they should be on separate spindles with separate drivers. Also, another reminder that when you are specifying the SQL Server, we do in fact support the syntax of having a SQL Server and instances. And if you are going to specify the SQL Server and its instance, you'll specify that using the SQL Server name first, then you'll do a backslash, and then you'll specify the actual instance name. Now, when I go through and create these databases, these databases will be created based upon the name that I specify for the Vault Store group. So the fingerprint database will start off with the letters E, V, V, S, G. Then it will be followed by the actual name that you gave the Vault Store group without any spaces. Then there will be an underscore, and then there will be a number. When you create the Vault Store database, it will start off with the letters E, V, V, S, and then the Vault Store name, followed by an underscore, followed by a number. And that Vault Store name will not have any spaces in it. So if you do go into the SQL Server Management Studio and you're looking for the databases, you can usually find them because, again, they start with that either EVVSG or just the EVVS for the Vault Store database. All right. Also, when you're working with the SQL Server, there's going to be a data source name or a DSN created. That data source name will be based upon the Vault Store name. And this is how the SQL services are going to communicate with the Enterprise Vault. Whenever you have databases, you need to have a data source name to allow that communication. Next thing we're going to look at is going to be the safety copy deletion. When you're setting up the environment for setting up the Enterprise Vault storage, you want to go through and specify when you want to have the safety copy removed. Now, the safety copy is technically the original item. So your first choice when you're setting it up is you can set it up to be never. When you set it up to be never, that says that you do not wish to have the safety copy removed, and you're typically only doing that during your initial setup or so that you can control it if you're doing the first archiving run so that you don't get an overload based upon the deletion of all those original items and the shortcut creation. But once you're actually set up and running in a production environment, you're typically going to choose after backup, especially for your mailbox archives. So once I've backed up the Exchange mailboxes, then I will go through and delete those copies on the Exchange server so that they only exist in the backup copy and in the archive. Now, you may find yourself in a situation where you have your Vault Store, and that Vault Store is going to be associated with both the mailbox and journal archive. And we will explain later when we get into the journal archiving lesson why you would prefer not to do that. But if you do have both the mailbox and journal archive going to the same Vault Store, typically for journaling, because that's every message that's going through your Exchange server is being sent to the journal mailbox, which is then being archived, you want those items deleted as soon as possible to minimize the amount of storage on that Exchange server. But for the mailboxes, you still want to back those up before you actually delete them. And then, of course, you do have the option for immediately after archive. If you do find yourself where you have different archives for your mailbox and your journal, you will typically, for the journal mailbox archive, have that one set up to be immediately after archive. So now we've created the Vault Store group and its associated fingerprint database. We've created the Vault Store, its associated database, and set up the safety copy deletion. We're now ready to move on to the physical part of the Enterprise Vault storage as opposed to the logical part, and that is the Vault Store partitions. So we're going to go through and look at how we set up and the different items that are available for configuration in the Vault Store partition. Again, this is a wizard. You can create it manually by going into the individual Vault Store, right-clicking on it, and saying that you wish to make a new partition. Or you can also continue on with the Vault Store partition wizard will immediately follow the Vault Store wizard. When you're creating it, the basic sequence is to name the partition and select that initial size, select the storage device, test your network connectivity, define the partition rollover, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, talk about having the security access control list and when you want the items backed up, and then we'll do a review, a summary, and complete the actual configuration of the partition. So the first thing, the wizard comes up and it prompts you for a name and a description for that particular partition. We don't have a screenshot. That's pretty standard, pretty basic. But then the next thing you're going to do is to select the initial state of the partition. This is where we're going to go through and look at and define the different states that you can find a partition in. The first state that we're going to discuss is going to be closed. The closed partition can be opened or it can be switched to a ready state. When a particular partition is closed, it is not writable. Now again, that doesn't mean you don't have access to that. You can still retrieve those items. You can still see that information that's associated with that particular partition, the archived items that are in that partition. It just means that it's not active, if you will, so you won't be routinely you won't be writing to that particular partition. And it's closed either when it's full or it can be closed on a specified date, and that's if you have partition rollover set up. Now you can manually go in and close a partition through the Enterprise Vault Administration Console as well. Next, we have an open partition. There's only one open partition that's available per Vault store. This is going to be the partition that we are actively writing the archive data into when we're physically storing the archives. If I were to change a closed partition to open, the currently open partition would go closed for us. The ready partition is available for what's called partition rollover. The idea here is that in earlier versions of Enterprise Vault, if you wanted to roll over your partitions, you perform that manually. Well, we want to be able to give you the capability of having that happen automatically based upon a set of conditions, and we'll be looking at those set of conditions a little bit later in the actual lesson. So when it's ready, it's typically empty, and you can have any number of ready partitions. These ready partitions can be any number of partition type, and you can actually set up the order of which you have the different currently open partitions roll over to those ready partitions. And we'll see some examples of that here a little bit later in the lesson. So as we said, part of the creation of the partition was to specify the storage device. When you're looking at the storage device, this is a list of the currently available storage devices for selection. You should always check the Enterprise Vault Compatibility Guide to see if the device that you're planning on using for your partition location is in fact a supported version of a storage device. So I'm not going to read off all the different ones here. They're also in the help file as well. Now, the next thing we want to discuss is the issue of what if you select one of these different types? Are there any nuances to selecting a particular type over another? And we're just going to select a few to discuss. The first one we're going to discuss is going to be for an NT file system or NTFS volume. When you're defining the NTFS file system store, you'll be prompted to specify the storage volume, the location or directory for that particular folder, and set certain storage settings. When you are using the NTFS file system, you cannot create any files at the root directory. They will be created in subdirectories, and you cannot extend those NTFS partitions through Enterprise Vault. You would have to use a third-party utility or a Windows administrative tool to be able to physically change the size of those partitions. If you had selected a network share as your partition location, you specify the Universal Naming Convention or UNC path to that particular location, and then based upon the type, you'll be prompted to know if the device is performing the deduplication and or the compression. And the idea is that if the device itself is doing deduplication and compression, we shouldn't necessarily want Enterprise Vault to do that for us. So we can have Enterprise Vault not do that, and we can let the device perform those types of actions. The next type of device that we can specify as a Vault Store partition is a NetApp device. When you specify the NetApp device, again, you'll specify the particular location for that partition. And then for the NetApp device, you not only have the option of specifying whether or not it's performing deduplication or compression, Also, the NetApp device has a snap block mode. And of course, if you're using the NetApp types of devices, you'll understand exactly what the snap block option does for you. But if the NetApp is doing all three of those types of functionality for you, then you can check all three of these items, and then that way Enterprise Vault will not do the data deduplication or the data compression. The last type of option that you have for a storage location, and again, this is not an all-inclusive list, we've just picked a few of them, is for the EMC Centera types of storage. In an EMC Centera type of an environment, it stores contents as objects identified by a content address. Enterprise Vault will then use that content address to access those items rather than using the file system. When it goes through and looks at that, you need to determine whether or not you wish to set the remove safety copy options for the EMC Centera storage, and whether or not to configure the EMC Centera collections. On the slide, we have a reference to a white paper that goes into more detail about all the different considerations if you are in fact using EMC Centera storage devices as your partition location. Now we're going to move on in the wizard for setting up the Vault Store partition, and the next section is to connect or check your connectivity. The idea of checking the connectivity is because we're going to be using this as a storage boundary for single instance storage. We want to make sure that the Vault Store database, the fingerprint database, as well as the physical storage location of the Vault Store partition can communicate. So when you do run the connectivity test, it will give you a connection rating. And on the slide, we have the different connection ratings that you can see, good, bad, very bad, and failed. Also, you do have the option of clicking the report button, and it will open up a little report that has that information in it as well. Now, just because this particular test fails doesn't mean that the system isn't correctly set up and will not work well for single instance storage. This particular test is using the ICMP protocol, and a lot of networks block that. That's the same protocol that's used for ping, so therefore if you've got ping blocked, you may not get a response. But you do want to check your network connectivity, and Symantec recommends that you have at least a 100 megabit per second local area network for verifying that you have reasonable connectivity to set up Vault Stores, Vault Store groups, Vault Store partitions. Next section with the Vault Store partition is rollover. Now, you do not have to configure partition rollover. This is just if you wish to have automatic rollover. So up there at the top where it says it's enabled based on time or volume, you can select the option to have it not configured. Now, when you do go through and select it, you can also base it on just time or just volume. Or as the example on the slide shows, you can base it upon both time or volume. If you select to base it upon volume, you have two different choices. You can base it when the volume reaches a certain percentage free, or you can base it upon when the volume reaches a certain amount of free space. And then when we're looking at the time option, you can base it after a certain period of time, 6 months, 3 weeks, or you could base it to have it happen at a specific date. Now, if you do as this particular example does, which is to enable it based on time or volume, whichever one occurs first will be the one that causes the partition to roll over. Now, in order for the partition rollover to work, you must have the open partition configured for partition rollover, and you must have a ready partition that it can roll over to. Next thing you're going to do is go through and specify as part of the Vault Store partition creation how you want to handle the access control list. Do you want to use the same access control list that was on the original item and carry that over into the Enterprise Vault environment? And then you also get the option of when you want to or how you wish to configure the backup checks, which is when you're going to check to determine if a particular item has been backed up for that safety copy removal. Now, another thing that can happen is that if you're going to be archiving items for a very long period of time, you may want to collect those particular files into a cab file and then move them to offline storage. So we're going to introduce that concept here. However, we'll get into it in more detail in a later lesson. When we get into the backing up and recovery lesson, we'll get into this in more detail. So if you have a message sent or received stored in your mailbox, that particular message is then archived after the period determined by the policy. And we'll start off in lesson 5 with defining the different types of mailbox policies that set up those rules for archiving. Once it has been archived, as we mentioned before, at some time the .dv files, which again could be any of the converted content, sys parts, or the per user part, has been archived, and you configure how long you want it to happen or wait. You'll convert those into a CAB file. And then you can take that CAB file and migrate it to the offline storage. And again, you'll do that some period that you specify after collection. And then maybe even after a longer period of time, you may decide to remove that particular CAB file off the Enterprise Vault by migrating it to a tertiary storage or even a backup. And again, we're just kind of introducing this concept of collection and migration because the Vault Store Partition Wizard will ask you about it. We'll get into more details about why to set it up and how to configure it in a later lesson. So moving on, we said that the Vault Store group was going to be our single instance storage boundary. So let's go through and talk about how to set up sharing levels which define how much sharing you're going to do for this deduplication and single instance storage. So our first example here is setting up the different sharing levels. So as we mentioned before, the outline we have here is the Vault Store group. In a Vault Store group, you're going to have multiple Vault Stores for this example. Vault Store 1 has 3 separate partitions. Vault Store 2 has 1 partition. One of the options that we have available is to share within the group. If we say share within the group, for this example, partition A, B, C in Vault Store 1 and partition A in Vault Store 2 will all be compared or considered against that fingerprint database, determine if an item is in fact identical and is available for sharing. Now the next type of sharing that's available is called share within Vault Store. Now if you select the share within Vault Store, when I go through and consider whether or not an item is available for sharing, I will only look at the partitions within a single Vault Store. So in this example, we've switched away from what we had originally, and now we have Vault Store 2 set up to share between partition A and B, but only within Vault Store 2. And we don't have anything shared with Vault Store 1 or any of the partitions there. We also have the option of configuring no sharing. If we select no sharing, then I will not actually go through and compare the fingerprints that I generate for the items with the fingerprints already stored. So therefore, there will be no deduplication or sharing, and therefore no single instance storage. Now another option is that you can combine the 3 of them, and we'll show you that as well. Because we wanted to give you the flexibility of you being as broad or as general for your sharing level or as specific as you need to be able to do. So this is showing you an example where I can set it up to have sharing within group for some partitions between Vault Stores. I can have it set up for sharing within Vault Store between some partitions within a Vault Store, and then I can have other partitions configured for no sharing. How do I set this up? Again, we said that our boundary is the Vault Store group. So in the Enterprise Vault Administration Console, we're going to navigate down through the site to the Vault Store groups, select the particular Vault Store group that we wish to configure the sharing for. In our example, we named our Vault Store group EV Server Group. We open it up and we go to the Properties page. Once the Property page opens, we'll go to the Sharing tab, and it will give you a list of all the Vault Stores that are in that Vault Store group and what their current sharing level is. So by default, when we created these items, the Corporate Compliance and the Information Management Vault Stores both had their sharing level set to share within Vault Store. But because we want to share with multiple different Vault Stores that we're going to be creating, we want to go ahead and change that to share within group. So we would click the Configure Sharing button in the lower right-hand corner of the dialog box, and that would bring up one of the 2 screens that you see now. In the top left, we've gone more generic. We said we want to set up all the Vault Stores in this particular Vault Store group with the same sharing level. And you can see from the drop-down that I can choose any of the 3 sharing levels. I can say no sharing, share within Vault Store, which is what it's currently set at, or share within group. But I also have the option, if I wish, to go ahead and select the option in the lower right, which is to customize the sharing. If I select customize sharing, it'll list each individual Vault store. I can then go to each individual Vault store and set the sharing level at the Vault store level. So again, we're just trying to show you here that you can be as general as you want or as specific as you need in your particular environment for setting up sharing. Some things to consider when you are setting up sharing, though, is that sharing level changes are not retroactive. What that means is that if I started off sharing between Vault stores, and in the previous example, Vault Store 1 and Vault Store 2, and some items were shared, and then I say, oops, I really didn't mean to do that. I want to go back and change it to just share within the Vault store. I don't want to share between the two groups. So you go back through the sharing dialog box and change it. Well, guess what? Everything that was already shared is still shared within the group. So you don't get that retroactive feature. Now everything that's now new considered for sharing will be shared within the store. So just realize it is not retroactive. Also, the network connectivity is a big issue because we are going to be doing a lot of communication between the fingerprint database, the Vault store database, as well as the physical partitions themselves. So therefore, you want to make sure that the connectivity is very good. You may want to go through and look at, for the sharing, to have different Vault store groups based upon your organization structure. A lot of times when we're talking about industry regulations or compliance, especially for like banking, I can't have my finance part of the company have anything to do with the marketing part or the banking part. So therefore, I may want to have two separate Vault groups so that I can keep those isolated but still share within banking and still share within finance. Also, when you create the Vault store group, you want to make sure that you configure the fingerprint database anticipating the number of items that you expect to be considering for sharing. So in this particular lesson, we went through and we learned about how the archive storage is configured and the basic logical structure of Vault store groups and Vault stores, and the physical structure of the Vault store partitions. And we looked at creating those items using the Enterprise Vault Administration Console. We also looked at how we configure the Vault sharing levels, which has the impact on our single instance storage and deduplication. Our reference materials include the Enterprise Vault Console Help, our installing and configuring guide, the setting up Exchange Server archiving, that's the first time we've mentioned that as a reference, and our administrator's guide is the first time. Don't forget about the compatibility list, and we do have a best practices white paper if you are using EMC Centera. This brings us to the end of Lesson 4.